Today's Bible reading is from John chapter 8, verses 1 to 11. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." And he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin."
Thanks, Marion. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you all this morning, and special welcome to visitors and newcomers too. Lovely to have you guys with us. And it's good to continue in our series this morning as we look at various encounters that Jesus had with people, as recorded in the Gospel of John. But before we get into it, I want to begin with a quote. This is a quote from Rick Warren. He says, "Our culture has accepted two huge lies. The first, that is, if you disagree with someone's lifestyle, you must fear or hate them. The second is that to love someone means you agree with everything they do or believe. Both are nonsense. You don't have to compromise convictions to be compassionate." Not sure how you find this quote. I find it resonates very deeply with me. I think more and more I feel like our culture allows us only two options: complete love and affirmation of something, or it must be hate or fear or denial or something. It's very common today for debates to be very polarized and always pitched in those two terms. Do you wholeheartedly agree with everything on an issue? Oh, if you don't, if you have some reservations, then you must be unloving or hateful. I remember, some of you might remember this during the same-sex marriage debate a few years ago. Cooper's Beer sponsored a discussion between two Liberal Party members, one who was pro same-sex marriage, one who was against it. And the two men sat down, they sort of talked about the pros and cons, they discussed their positions while drinking Cooper's Beer, of course. And they sort of agreed to disagree, they shook hands in peace. And the outcry was enormous. Some of you might recall this at the time. Bars all over the country boycotted Cooper's Beer for their role in this video. There's videos online of out the back of pubs, barkeepers smashing their Cooper's Beer supply on the ground, for them supposedly encouraging the politics of hate. It was interesting, Cooper's hadn't really even taken a side on the issue. They were just looking for some clever marketing, which obviously backfired terribly. But even being associated with something that gave air to one side of this debate was seen as being hateful and cruel. In the end, Cooper's made sort of this hand-wringing apology so as not to lose too much market share. The last line of that quote from Rick Warren again: "You don't have to compromise convictions to be compassionate." You don't have to compromise convictions to be compassionate. I think it's true, but I also think it's really hard. It's really hard to do, and it's hard to communicate in a world where everyone has to be labelled as either a friend and an ally or an enemy, an adversary. Can we be compassionate without compromising our convictions? Well, I think in today's encounter with Jesus, we see how he does this in an incredible way. I want to really look at this passage and what we can learn from it. I also want to be really upfront. There is a slight difficulty to this passage. For those of you perhaps reading your own Bibles or along at home, you might have this passage in italics or in square brackets or with a footnote. I was kind of in two minds about whether to include this bit in my message, but I want to be completely upfront. My NIV says this: the earliest manuscripts and many other ancient witnesses do not have John 7:53 to 8:11. A few manuscripts include these verses wholly or in part after John 7:36, John 21:25, Luke 21:38, or Luke 24:53. This is a little bit awkward. The first copies of the Gospel of John don't include our passage today. And some other manuscripts have them in different spots. What do we do with this? Well, I would say this passage probably wasn't in the first written copy of John, but it was still an accurate account of an event that took place in Jesus' life. And people remembered it. They knew it happened. It circulated as a story, an oral tradition, and eventually it was written down. This story is very consistent with Jesus' actions in the New Testament. And while it's not in those first copies, it's early enough that it gets included in every Bible that you'd have. For a scholarly analysis, Bruce Metzger, who was a committee member of the United Bible Society's Greek New Testament, he agrees. He says this passage is not original to the first copy of John, but then he says this: at the same time, the account has all the earmarks of historical veracity. It was obviously a piece of oral tradition which circulated in certain parts of the Western Church and was subsequently incorporated into various manuscripts at various places. This is the challenge, right, of dealing with real texts written by real people. It's a very historical, kind of earthly challenge. It's a little bit awkward. That's why I want to be really upfront about it. But I still want us to read this with confidence. This is God's word. This is an encounter that Jesus had in history with a person that he met. And its placement fits as well, I think, very clearly. See, just before this passage, Jesus has gone to Jerusalem and has been teaching at the Feast of the Tabernacles. Crowds of people have gathered. They adore Jesus' teaching. But the local religious authorities, including some Pharisees, they were furious at Jesus' popularity. They were jealous of how famous he'd become. And as this feast goes on, and you read the passages before this one, Jesus' claims kind of get bolder and bolder. The crowd gets more and more excited, and his adversaries get more and more angry. And on the last day of the feast, Jesus claims that streams of living water come from him. It's an image he uses to refer to the Holy Spirit. Many people are believing in Jesus, although some are a bit confused. But at this point, the Pharisees have had enough. They want to kill Jesus, but they're unable to do so because of the crowd. And so the day comes to an end. Let me pick it up at chapter 7:53. Then they all went home, it says. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. Here's what happened. The end of the festival, Jesus' boldest day, the Pharisees returned to their homes frustrated. And that night, it seems pretty clear, they plotted about how they could trap Jesus. At the same time, Jesus heads off to the Mount of Olives in the evening to pray and presumably to sleep as well. And at dawn, he's back, right back in the temple courts, no questions. He makes an early start. The crowds are gathering straight away. And then there's this big commotion. This group of Pharisees and teachers of the law, they drag in this woman who they claim was caught in adultery. Now, there's sort of all sorts of theories about how this could have happened. Some have speculated that the man in the scenario, who's obviously not here, was in cahoots with the Pharisees. It's possible. The fact that they can produce this woman, though, is quite impressive, really. I think it's most likely they were already aware of this kind of situation of infidelity in Jerusalem, and they thought this is the night to act, to trap Jesus. And look, it's definitely worth noting, the man is nowhere to be seen, right? Only the woman has been dragged before Jesus. So she's brought before him and the crowd, and they make their case. "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" And they're correct, by the way, about the law. There it is, Leviticus 20. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, the wife of his neighbour, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death. It's a good trap. It's a very good trap, isn't it? They state the law, they present the case in question, and they ask Jesus, "Now what do you say?" Let's have a think about what Jesus' options are here. One option is to simply affirm what the Pharisees have said and agree, you know what, you're right, this woman should be taken and stoned. He could condemn the sin very clearly, follow the law, agree with the verdict. It's the approach of the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. It's logical, follows the code, doesn't it? But it's heartless. It's heartless. And given Jesus' growing reputation as a man of love and compassion, it would probably put off many of his followers and make him unpopular. The other option is to challenge the Pharisees and maybe challenge the law too. And there's a sense in which this is what the Pharisees were probably hoping for, probably expecting. They know Jesus isn't going to condemn this woman to death. They want him to challenge the law, and so then they can paint him as a troublemaker. He doesn't care about the law of Moses. He doesn't care about our thousands of years of Jewish history. He doesn't take sin seriously. He downplays its seriousness. He condones sin. Before we look at what Jesus does, I guess I'd love you to have a little think. Have you ever been in this situation? I reckon we are all in this situation, maybe not as bluntly, but at some point where you've been presented with someone who's living out some kind of sinful behaviour, something that clearly goes against God's good plan, and your convictions, you know this is wrong. And yet you do not want to condemn this person, do you? You want to show love and acceptance and grace. So what do you do? In politics recently, there's been some good examples of what they're calling the gotcha question. You might have seen this a couple of times. I remember in the debates before last federal election, one moderator asked Bill Shorten in one of the debates if he knew the price of the Nissan Leaf. I remember this very clearly, which was one of the leading hybrid cars. And Shorten didn't know the answer, and so it was kind of seen as a bit of a gotcha question. You know, he was caught out. He wasn't across the sort of the detail here. Now again, regardless of what you think of the issue or Shorten's memory or whether that's important, this is like the Christian gotcha question, what we're dealing with today, isn't it? Someone comes to you with an example of sin and says, "What do you say?" Maybe it's a Christian, a friend who you know is pretty tough on morality. Or maybe it's someone who doesn't follow Jesus who's bringing this question to you. There's no easy answer, is there? There's none. When you're pushed on an example of sin, your options are limited. Do you condemn it and seem cruel and hard-hearted and put off any people listening who don't know Jesus? Or do you just condone the sin and feel like you're kind of throwing your convictions to the wind? What do you say? Here's what Jesus did. Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. It's a fascinating approach, isn't it? We don't know what Jesus was writing on the ground. Plenty of speculation. It might have been the words he just said. Some might think it was a diversion so that he wasn't, eyeballing the Pharisees when he asked them whether they could realize their own sinfulness. Some have emphasized that he deliberately lowers himself to a position so that everyone's standing above him, including this woman who's there. This is probably my suspicion. If you're standing up with someone and you're talking with them, maybe it's getting a bit heated. If that person you're talking with then suddenly crouches down and the dynamic is completely changed. It's quite an odd thing to do, but for Jesus here with a big crowd, it's a humble and it's a gentle thing he's done. Very gentle to this guilty one who's standing there. He voluntarily adopts a lowly position. He doesn't take the kind of literal or moral high ground. In the end, it probably doesn't matter too much. The big point here is clear. Jesus is helping the accusers to see they too are sinners, aren't they? They too fail God and God's desire for their lives. He doesn't defend the woman's actions. He doesn't question the law of Moses. He just turns their question around and challenges them. And so despite the law clearly stating this woman should be killed, none of them can take that moral high ground. None of them can and begin that process of stoning, and so they leave. It's a great lesson for us, isn't it? It's a wonderful lesson when we're tempted maybe to take the option of condemning sin. It's a reminder to turn the mirror back on ourselves, to check our own heart, our own obedience, our own sinfulness. Can we really take the high ground here? There's a little extra punch in this as well from Jesus. Because who is the one without sin? Who is the only person who would be qualified to throw the first stone? Well, it's Jesus himself. All the others leave. The only people standing there now are Jesus, the one without sin, and the guilty woman. And yet, of course, he doesn't throw a stone, does he? This is what Jesus says. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." Jesus says two things here. He says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." And I want to consider these two statements very carefully. Let's firstly think about the woman. "I do not condemn you," is Jesus' word to her. This woman's been caught in adultery. Take that at face value. He's got every right to judge her for her actions, for her infidelity, to find her guilty. Jesus forgives. He shows her radical acceptance and forgiveness. He radically accepts sinners like this woman. But he's not finished, is he? He then says, "Go now and leave your life of sin." This is the other side to the story. He presents this woman with a call to change. He doesn't say, "I forgive you, so go back and keep sinning as you were." No, he clearly states what she was doing was wrong, was sinful. He calls her to change, to stop that, to stop sinning. She's been accepted by Jesus totally, unconditionally. And now Jesus says, "Go and leave your life of sin." That second thing is essential to complete the picture. See what Jesus does here? Recall our Rick Warren quote from before. He does disagree with what this woman has done, but he clearly doesn't fear her or hate her. He loves her. As Warren says, and Jesus demonstrates, you don't have to compromise convictions to be compassionate. Now, sadly, we don't know what it meant for this woman. This is all we get of this woman in the gospel. Just a few short verses. She's unnamed, she's unknown. I want to speculate for a moment here. I think this episode would have shaken her to her core. She was caught in sin and she knew it. You know, people talk about the walk of shame. I mean, she was dragged from the bedroom straight into the temple courtyard. Who knows what she was wearing? Her life was now in the balance of a handful of accusing men and also this one young rabbi. She was dead to rights, but this young rabbi confronts the accusers and offers her forgiveness with that final command to leave her sin behind. We can't know if she became a follower of Jesus, but I would bet her life was transformed by this encounter. What about in our encounters with others? How might this passage help us? I think Jesus here really provides a wonderful model as to how we can conduct life and ministry. Neither to condemn nor condone sin, but to forgive sin. To forgive sin. Here's what I think we can learn. Firstly, forgiveness always comes first. This is absolutely crucial in responding to anyone. For Jesus, forgiveness and acceptance, it's always the first response. He accepts this woman before he calls her to change. He doesn't expect her to clean up her life in order to be good enough for him. He doesn't expect anyone to clean up their life before he will receive them. There's a famous hymn, you might know the words, "Just as I am." And I think the words ring true. One line is this: "Just as I am, and waiting not to rid my soul of one dark blot, to thee whose blood can cleanse each spot, O Lamb of God, I come, I come." Sometimes we think we need to tidy up our lives before we can come to Jesus. I know of people, look, maybe you're in the same boat, no judgment here, who have a cleaner at home and they like to clean their house before the cleaner comes. That's something I've heard a few times. Not sure if you can relate with that. I find it quite strange. And I think Jesus would find it quite strange too. You don't need to clean up your life before Jesus cleans it up for us. Nobody has to fix up their life before Jesus accepts them. And so first and foremost, to a world that doesn't know Jesus, our message is grace. It's forgiveness, it's acceptance and welcome, just like Jesus. I wonder how you find this. I imagine for many of you this comes very naturally. Some people I know love to reach out to the lost, the sinful, the broken, and accept them wholly. But maybe for some of us, this is quite hard. Sometimes people have attitudes we find hard to deal with. Sometimes people have sin in their life that's very obvious. But Jesus says to a woman like this, caught in adultery, guilty under the law, I do not condemn you. Our challenge is to be like Jesus here, to radically welcome sinful people. Secondly, forgiven sinners are called to live God's way. Jesus does this with the woman, doesn't he? Once she's forgiven, once she's accepted, he challenges her to change. He calls this newly forgiven woman to leave her life of sin. This is harder, I think, perhaps even for us. And there really could be a whole sermon about doing this. Let me just give a few summary points. This is always, I think, best in the context of relationship. If a Christian stranger comes to me and find out they're involved in some kind of sinful practice, I almost definitely won't mention it. But if a good Christian friend, someone I've prayed with, someone I've shared with, starts doing something we both know is not in God's good plan, I'll feel much more comfortable to say, what are you doing? Secondly, whenever we're thinking of this, we have to acknowledge our own sinfulness. This is what the Pharisees did, didn't it? A wonderful moment, a rare moment of self-awareness. They reflected, they understood their own sin, and they walked away. And they decided they couldn't challenge this woman. Whenever we approach someone, we have to acknowledge our own sinfulness and be humble and careful. And thirdly, I want to say, this can be done really well in the abstract. And this is really what I do when I preach, isn't it? I'll give examples perhaps of sin, of behavior, and I'll allow them to resonate where they will. I don't need to know everyone's dark secrets. You do, and God does, and the Holy Spirit does. Same for me. See, this is what Jesus does with the Pharisees, doesn't it? He doesn't name their sins. He could, he would know them. But he allows God to convict them on their own. Still hard though, I think, really, really hard to challenge Christians to change, to leave behind sin and live for God. But like Jesus, we do need to be willing to stand up against sin and encourage people to change. Third thing I want to say is the order here is so important. It's always forgiveness first, and only then would we challenge someone to change. This means our message to those who don't know Jesus is always grace. It's only people who already know God's grace who are called to live God's way. In 1 Corinthians, there's a great example of this. Paul's dealing with this issue in the church, and he talks about the need to challenge Christians in the church to change, to leave sin behind. But he says this is a challenge for followers of Jesus only. He writes this, 1 Corinthians 5. What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Really helpful words. Now, some of you might balk at the idea of judging others inside the church at all. Others of you might think, really, we can judge people outside the church. Paul makes a very clear distinction here. And make sure we're not preaching legalism or judgmentalism to those who don't follow Jesus. Our message to people who don't know Jesus is always forgiveness and love. It's people who already know Jesus, like myself, who need to continue to hear that call to change in response. Sinners need forgiveness, and forgiven sinners need to stop sinning. And finally, I want to say we need to not look for a balance. This is really important here, I think. The things Jesus says are two extremes. He shows extreme forgiveness and welcome and love to an adulterer guilty under the law. And he upholds extreme standards of holiness. Think of those Pharisees, law-keeping. Their sins would have been tiny, and yet he challenges them. Extreme forgiveness and extreme holiness. The danger is to try and find a middle ground, I think. to show people some love, but also require some change. I think this is very dangerous. We might have that risk of expecting people to change some parts of their life before they can know Jesus, but then be relaxed about some other sinful behavior. Please maybe sort out your sexual immorality, your drug use, then you can join us once that serious stuff is sorted. But, as a Christian, well, if you can keep living a life of greed, yeah, that's fine. You can keep being unloving. No, Jesus doesn't compromise. There's no middle ground. There's no balancing point here. He maintains two extremes. I accept you no matter what you do, no matter who you are, just as you are. You can come to me. And now I call you to leave your life of sin, everything that's against God's will, big things and small things. We need to hold both extremes and avoid trying to find a balance. But I want to say, as helpful as Jesus' words are for us in engaging with others, these are words for us, aren't they? See, we are this woman, aren't we? Perhaps we're not adulterers like her, but just as she was caught in the act of sin, so in God's eyes, we're also caught in the act. Before God, there's not going to be any arguments about whether there's enough evidence to convict us. God can show us the tapes of 1,000 ways that we've let him down. Maybe thinking evil of others, maybe gossip, maybe it's greed or lust, maybe it's drunkenness, maybe it's pride. We know that like this woman, I know that like this woman, God has every right to find me guilty. In God's eyes, here I stand, a man caught in the act. And yet, despite how clearly we fail God, despite how certain is my condemnation, God's words to us are the same as to this woman. I do not condemn you. I do not condemn you. See, we are this woman, aren't we? Just as we are, forgiven and accepted by Jesus. I don't know how you find Jesus' forgiveness of you. Maybe you have trouble accepting it. Maybe you suspect Jesus still does condemn you, maybe because of what you've done in the past or recently, of your history perhaps. Maybe you suspect Jesus' condemnation still kind of remains on you, that God looks down on you sternly, that you need to keep doing good things to earn your salvation. Maybe even other Christians have reinforced this belief with words or actions. Maybe in the condemnation of others, you suspect you also see the condemnation of God. If that's you, please clearly hear Jesus' words today. I do not condemn you, Jesus says. I do not condemn you. We are this woman, aren't we? Forgiven by Jesus from our sin, given acceptance and peace, and then called. Go and leave your life of sin. There's no downplaying of what we've done. Jesus doesn't pretend our sins haven't happened. He cares deeply for holiness. And so we're called to change our lives as one of God's forgiven children, wholly loved, totally accepted. God calls us to turn our lives around to live holy lives. You've been forgiven, Jesus says. So leave sin behind. You've been set free from sin, so stop acting like you're still a slave. Maybe for some of us, this is the harder thing to hear. Maybe it's easy to accept Jesus' forgiveness. You know God's grace and his acceptance. Maybe you know it so well, there's a risk you take it for granted. Perhaps since knowing God's love, you really haven't changed your life much at all. You've happily accepted forgiveness for sin and then thoughtlessly walked straight back into it again. If that's you, let me very gently remind us all of Jesus' challenge today. Go now and leave your life of sin. Jesus doesn't condemn sin, does he? And he doesn't condone it. He forgives sin, and he calls forgiven sinners to change. I do not condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin.